a Superman action figure in a toy coffin, a blue shirt and red jacket, a first flight in the sun above the Arctic tundra. These are some of the moments that define my Superman fandom. Together on this podcast, we journey across time and media to examine, discover, and reconsider the creative visions that have shaped the Man of Steel. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss Superman in the Silver Age is returning guest and my dear friend, Rich Roney. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm really I'm eager for this discussion.
Yes, you more than any guest for any of my various podcasts. With you, we have more discussions about what we're going to talk about in advance of and more recaps after the episode than any other guest. But I treasure all of the conversations, the one that we record that everyone can hear or watch, but also all the prep that we do and the post-mortem afterward. I genuinely enjoy and treasure all of those chats.
Echo that.
So last episode, of course, we covered the Golden Age, and here we are now talking about Superman in the Silver Age, typically defined as the period from about 1956 to 1970 or thereabouts. Is that your general, understanding of what's considered the Silver Age?
Yes. Though I would put a small caveat for Superman. I absolutely agree with the time frame, but for Superman, I think the Silver Age for Superman started in 1958.
Yes, and we're going to talk. So we're obviously going to be talking about the era generally, and we also have specific stories that we're going to be touching on. But the first official story on our list is Action Comics 241, the Super Key to Fort Superman from 1958, considered by many to be the official start of the Silver Age for Superman. So the Silver Age might have started a couple of years earlier, but it didn't really get to Superman until 1958. And, I just to do a tiny bit of cleanup from the last episode and segue into this episode, and I know this is something that you and I have touched on in our private conversations, with Superman in particular, do you agree there's a bit of a nebulous period from like the end of the 40s into the early to mid 50s, right?
Yeah.
That didn't quite totally fit into golden or silver?
Very much so. Yes. If I had to be a diamond cutter and precisely do it, it's not possible. Where the Earth 2 Superman stopped and the Earth 1 Superman started, it is very nebulous. Almost, I would say, from 1949 to, again, probably 1958. The stories were done in one, but they really didn't fit it into the Golden Age nor the Silver Age.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, of course, you were on the show a while back and we did a pair of epic discussions on the George Reeves TV series. And it seems from, the reading about Superman in the Silver Age that I've done that, that TV series really had a pronounced effect on the comics at the time, and that there really was an effort to keep the TV show and the comics in sync. So a lot of the stories, and we talked about that in those episodes that we did, where there were a number of stories that you could read in comic book form and also watch on television. So it seems like the television show definitely had a major influence, and then that ended right around the time that we're talking about here at the official start of Silver Age for Superman.
Very much so. Yes. I think 1958 was the final year the TV show was broadcast live. And yeah, there was almost a very thoughtful. I remember when we chatted about the George Reeves show, speaking that I forget who the major showrunner was, but Whitney
Right.
Ellsworth, and then Mort Weisinger, and they said at that time they really didn't take planes; they took a train out to Los Angeles, and they apparently drafted or crafted or set up like 20 plus stories. And then I'm sure when Mort Weisinger returned to New York, he figured, well, look, I did all this work. Why don't I turn it over to an artist?
Exactly. So over the course of this episode, again, we'll be talking about what the Silver Age was like for Superman generally, We'll be talking about some specific stories. We'll be talking about some publishing history. You shared some quite staggering sales figures with me, and we'll get into that as well. But I want to kind of start it on a personal note because I think that's always the most interesting piece of this, right? And the show is called, a Superman fan journey. And for you in particular, I know that Silver Age Superman played a pivotal role in your history as a Superman fan. I mean, there's a reason you're here for this episode. So, I mean, could you, just to give as much as I know a lot of this from all of our conversations, could you give our audience a little bit of context? I mean, you grew up reading Silver Age Superman, right?
Yes, yes. Okay, so I'll try to keep it brief because I do have the ability to go protract the discussion. But real quickly for your listeners, um, I just turned 65. I grew up in the very, very thick of the 1960s. I was a big fan. I got to see reruns of The Adventures of Superman with George Reeves, and I saw those first. And then when I was about 7 or 8 years old, I started noticing comics, and especially the overlap, the intersection between the TV show and the comic, especially with Superman the character. As you know, the first comic book I ever bought that's indelible in my memory is World's Finest 143, where Superman and Batman team up. But I've always loved the Kurt Swan 1960s rendition of Superman. That's far and away my favorite.
Gotcha. And as much as we're going to get into all of this as we move forward, just to kind of tee this up for anyone who maybe hasn't really read much Silver Age Superman, or maybe they haven't in a really long time, big picture, what are the hallmarks of Superman stories set in the Silver Age? Like, when you think back, even before this reread that we did in advance of this episode, I mean, again, what do you identify most, either plot wise, story wise, thematically, with Superman stories during this period of time?
Okay, and you threw me a curveball, so I got so micro focused. Let me back it up, but I would say, and I want you to step in for if I miss anything, but most of these stories were definitely written for 10-year-olds. They were definitely done in one. There was no continuing stories, or they were very, very rare. So it was done in one. Superman had almost an outrageous power set. He could juggle planets. So one of the challenges, one of the hallmarks really is that there had to be a lot of stories where they created an environment where he was deprived of his powers, and it showed his courage and his ingenuity. There were a lot of silly covers. I mean, the cover sold the story, so there'd be a gimmicky or a stunning cover to capture your interest. Um, Done in one, but the status quo was always reset at the end. And they certainly, between 1958 and 1970, really created a profound mythos where they incrementally added to the mythos periodically, and I think that kept the stories fresh until the end of the Silver Age. Uh, the other things quickly, there were a lot of stories that focused on, oh God, Red Kryptonite helped them out a lot. The rivalry between Lois Lane and Lana for Superman's love and affection, and to whom they wanted to marry, and a lot of stories where Clark had to preserve his secret identity. So,
I
spontaneously, that's the take.
I agree, though I'm shocked you didn't say robots. I thought robots would have been one of the top three things, because that's certainly one of my takeaways
Oh, oh,
from this little reading assignment.
I'm so sorry, Anthony. I am saving that when we get when we get into the mythos. And you give me the hook because I can run at the mouth. But one thing I kind of want to say is 1958. I didn't know this till you engaged me for this discussion. So I started looking at stories more intensely. I started lining up creators with particular stories. And what stunned me, and I know we're going to talk about this, but in a real tight time frame in 1958, there was that Action 241. There was Action 242. There was the first Supergirl story, and then there was the first Legion of Superheroes. But I never knew this until this morning when I started syncing things up. Otto Binder wrote 3 of the 4 foundational stories for the Silver Age. Al Plastino did the artwork. And those stories, the Action 241, 242, Supergirl, the Legion, I really think they were the foundation. And when you look at those stories by themselves, they're not that powerful. But boy, did they build a foundation for the whole mythos, that evolved really over the next 12 years.
So on that note, I have one more question on the personal side for you, because we had a phone call about a week or so ago where you had started your reading assignment for this episode, and you called and you shared something that I guess I was kind of surprised, and I was saddened to hear, because the goal, hopefully, as we read or reread various stories, is that hopefully they'll hold up, or that we'll come to them fresh and enjoy them. But you had a bit of a different experience. Would you mind sharing what, because again, like we established, you grew up reading these stories. I know you came into this reading project and this episode with a lot of affinity, a lot of love for this time period. And what happened when you started reading these issues?
Well, let uh, let me tell your audience and your listeners. I did research this. I queried a number of websites like Comics Alliance and CBR. I Googled greatest Silver Age Superman stories. I Googled greatest Superman stories by decade. And to your listeners, I proposed a list of, I think, about 15 or 17 or 18 stories, that were in this time period. And these were the greatest stories by different websites and different critics. I got to tell you, Anthony, even today, as I was writing up some of my notes to chat with you, I really feel demoralized. Some of these stories, sadly, much as I have phenomenal love, I'm just demoralized. They don't hold up well, right? And it kills me. It hurts me in my heart. I Some of these I almost wish I had not reread, because I would have liked to have preserved the fonder memory. So now I much as I'm hurt, I still got to salute the creators. I mean, some of the artwork is beautiful. Some of the constraints the writers had to deal with, um, what they were subjected to, with the tenor of society in the times. I think all were all constraints. So, but that being said, you're going to get the best out of me with my opinions and thoughts and perspectives. But I did some of these. I had a hard time. I mean, I even would read 3 or 4 pages, and then just like throw it back on my desk and go somewhere else.
I wanted to talk about this up front because I think this is an important piece in any fan journey, yours, mine, anyone's, regardless of the character. And I think that for anyone watching or listening, even if they don't have the exact same experience with Silver Age Superman, I'm sure there's something where, you enjoy something as a kid, it really means a lot to you. And it holds a special place for you in your mind and your heart, and you build it up and you go back to it, and it doesn't hold up. Maybe you question, why did I even like this in the first place? Actually, that is a question for you. Do you ask yourself that question, or can you still see, okay, I get why I like this at the time. It's just that it doesn't still work for me. Was it a little bit of that, or was this like completely shattered where you were wondering, why did I even like this in the first place? Where did you kind of land?
Probably on the position that parts of it I still have great love for and respect. Um, and truthfully, who knows? As I think this through, um, 4 or 5 years from now, I might reread one of these stories and have yet a different view. Uh, um, the other thing I got to say, and you know this, look, I read these stories 55 years ago. The sensibilities and the life experiences I have now, and also the evolution of writing. I mean, they can write stories where they let the characters breathe. So my tastes having evolved, the prowess of writing having evolved, the structure and cadence of stories, I'm looking at these stories from 1962 or 1965 through the lens of the current world, and more mature stories like Kingdom Come or some of the other Superman stories that are more adult, more thoughtful, more thought provocative. But some of these I will always love. I will always love. It's just that a few of them, and you're going to hear it. I'm going to be very critical when we start unpacking certain stories that are on our mutual list.
Again, I understand, and I've been fortunate so far for the most part with this podcast when I've been going back to something to reread or rewatch. For the most part, either it holds up as well as I remembered it, or in a lot of cases, I'm finding a new way to enjoy something. I'm enjoying it more than I ever did the first time. I'm appreciating it in a new way. I actually have a specific example that I'll share later in this episode. But that's not always the case. A little while back, I did an episode on the Superman 2 movie, both the theatrical cut as well as the Richard Donner version of the movie. And that was a movie I grew up loving. And in my mind, it was always like, yeah, the first two Superman movies, like they're great. When I sat down and I watched both cuts of that movie, and it did not hold up for me. There was a lot that I just really found off, at least in terms of what I want out of the Superman character and a Superman movie. And so, it was sad. I mean, I wasn't happy about that. It wasn't the sort of thing where I'm like, oh, I'm glad I see everything that's wrong with this movie. That, there, so I definitely understand that feeling. And I'm sure for a lot of fans out there, they can identify. That's kind of always the tricky thing with this. Cause again, in an ideal scenario, it holds up, but that's not always the case. And, you know, that was the question that I was going to ask you that you answered. And I'm sad to hear, that you really feel like in a lot of these instances, you wish you hadn't even gone back to it. And I guess that's the risk, right? When you go back to something that you have this love for. Another example, completely unrelated to comics, and I know this is not something that was ever part of your fandom, but Power Rangers, the Power Rangers television show. I grew up, I love that. I mean, I watched it every day. I made sure as soon as I got home from school, I watched it. I remember I was taping episodes. I loved it. And they're all on Netflix now. And over the past couple of years, I've gone back and I've watched episodes for the first time since I was a kid. And I will say I can appreciate and understand why I liked them the first time, which is good. So I'm watching, I'm like, oh, okay, like I get why I like this. But they definitely don't entertain me in the same way. And I can see the seams, and I can see where, it doesn't quite hold up. But thankfully, for the most part, it doesn't take away from my overall love of Power Rangers. And the reason is, and this is what I'll offer if this is any solace, is whether it's Power Rangers for me or Silver Age Superman for you, they served a specific function in our lives and our fandoms. And, for you, I mean, those Silver Age Superman stories made you a Superman fan, made you a comic book fan and reader, set you on a path. If not for that, there are all these other stories and people, you would have never, interacted with.
Unless I was a smoker.
And so, yes, that's a reference to a different podcast. But uh, the point being that they served a specific function for you. And no, you might not enjoy them the same way today that you did as a kid. And to be perfectly honest, I mean, I don't know how likely that would be, for the reasons that you've already described. I mean, these really were written for kids. So it makes sense that as a kid in the 60s, these really grabbed your attention, as a fully grown, man
As
in the,
not
in the
as fully as an
2020s.
old man, as an old man, I'm over 65. I'm Medicare, buddy.
So, you're at a completely different place in your life. So I think it's perfectly understandable. But again, they still served a critical function, and I guess my point is they did what they needed to do for you. And even if they don't quite still do that now, they serve their function.
Yeah, and if I may, give me a minute, and then I want you to react. Uh, as you know, and you and I discussed this in a prior podcast. God, I love the George Reeves Adventures of Superman TV show. In the same fashion, I have profound loyalty and love and enthusiasm for the Edmund Hamilton and the Kurt Swan, George Klein, those stories. But one thing I was gonna say, the Superman that I've come to love and respect and the stories I enjoy most, to me, the characteristics he exhibits, he's intelligent, he's thoughtful, he's concerned, he's courageous. And I know you've discussed the other portrayals of Superman in the Golden Age, where I think even Mike called him an outlaw. Well, geez, in the Silver Age that we're speaking about, he's really a role model. He's very characteristic of law and order. I don't think he's a, a policeman, but he's very very pro the status quo, very socially responsible. So to my mind, he's got some fantastic attributes. He's intelligent, concerned, courageous, thoughtful. I mean, even the word balloons, I enjoyed reading the things, and I enjoyed the facial expressions Kurt Swan embedded. So there's a lot of positive aspects, and I think for a 10-year-old child, he was a great the way he was portrayed, he was a great role model.
On that
So,
note, because I did want to ask you about this, are there, I don't know, any specific memories or instances where you can really recall a Superman comic shaping your morality, your worldview, the way you conducted yourself? Or even if it's not, a specific instance, just generally speaking. I mean, I guess to what extent did the example that Superman set in the pages of these Silver Age comics, like to what extent did that impact the way you conducted yourself as you were growing up?
um, I don't think there was any triggering event. Um, and we're going to get into this with a couple of these stories. Um, but later in time, I'd almost like to go back more thoughtfully and read certain stories. I only got a glimmering, just a hint of this, but some of the writers really used Kendor and the backstory there to voice opinions on society. Um, Clearly, one of the things here is, I mean, boy, everyone talks about diversification and diversity and appreciation for uh, all forms of humanity right now, race, gender, on and on. They were doing that in these stories here. Superman was always respectful of every race, every culture, every religion, every ethnicity. So there were good values on that level, and also I think sincerely they really did espouse honesty and respect for others. So I would say those values. I don't think it was solely related. There was a host of other things, but clearly those were the characteristics that were espoused in these stories.
Understood. And so let me give my take now on my experience reading these stories. And in virtually every instance, I was reading these for the first time. A lot of these stories I had read about. I had read stories that drew from these original comics, but I hadn't read them, themselves until this assignment. And let me just rattle off a few just so people have a little bit more context. And again, we'll talk about each of these in greater detail as we move forward. But again, the super key to Fort Superman, the sort of the unofficial kickoff to the Silver Age for Superman. First Brainiac, first Supergirl, Jimmy Olsen, number 37, Superman's super rival, Adventure 271, How Luther Met Superboy. As a Smallville fan, that one was particularly interesting. Superman 141, Return to Krypton. 149, The Death of Superman. Again, for this fan, very, very interesting. Superman 156, The Last Days of Superman. Action 300, Superman Under the Red Sun. And Superman 162, The Amazing Story of Superman Red and Superman Blue. There were a few others you had on your list. That was specifically what I focused on. And I really want to thank you for selecting these stories to represent this era. It was, again, a fascinating experience. So generally speaking, those are kind of the stories that we're drawing from as we make our way through this episode. But again, for the most part, I was reading these for the first time. And I will be honest, listeners heard in the last episode, I was really, really taken with Golden Age Superman, particularly the earliest pre World War II incarnation of the character, where he was, as you said, and as Mike had said, an outlaw. I mean, he was really standing up to bullies, taking on corrupt orphanage superintendents and sinister landlords and wife beaters, and again, really standing up to bullies on behalf of the underdog. He was really felt like a man of the people. He was tough, he was raw, he didn't have anywhere near the level of power that he would have down the line, and there was just a dynamic energy and electricity to those stories, and I genuinely enjoyed them. It wasn't even just that from an academic perspective, it was interesting. I thought they were like, I really enjoyed them. I did not have that exact same experience with the Silver Age, though I did find it worthwhile in its own way. As far as barriers to like true, true genuine enjoyment, I think I would point to a lot of what you've already espoused. You know, the sensibilities were very different. These were written for kids. Very heavy on the exposition. They were very innocent. These stories, would kind of only go so far, into adult territory. But positives, because I want to start with the positives. It was really cool to see where so many elements of the mythology that I'm very familiar with, that I've grown up watching and reading, to see where they came from. The second story on this list is the first appearance of Brainiac. I've read a ton of Brainiac stories. I had never read his first appearance. Even if that story itself didn't blow me away, I as I was going through that issue and a number of others, I had to continually kind of check myself and say, hey, listen, you've read a lot of stories that follow this, that borrow from this, but this is where it started. And so I have a lot of respect for the stories and a lot of respect for what a lot. I mean, and I think just big picture, this era added so much. I mean, these stories were really sci-fi influence. Again, long gone were the days of, tearing down tenements that were corrupting, the the youth of America, right? He's fighting Brainiac, and he's meeting Supergirl, and he's discovering the bottle city of Condor. I mean, it's again a very different feel, but it added so many elements to the mythology that now we all kind of take for granted. So it was really cool to see that. And even more specifically than that, there were specific stories that, I'm very familiar with, and I got to see the stories that inspired them. I know we're going to talk more about robots later, but there was a story, and I don't know if you ever read it. You probably didn't. The Dominus King of the World storyline from the late 90s. Are you familiar with this at all? No.
No, sorry, no.
We're actually going to touch on that in an upcoming episode. I won't get too deep into it now, but basically, there's this villain Dominus who influences Superman's mind, and Superman effectively takes over the world. And to help him do that, he builds an army of Superman robots. And so this was a story that I read in
Ah,
in '98, and I remember at the time I was like, "Boy, this the deal with these robots." So now I got to read these stories where the robots are all over the place. Similarly, one of the stories that we're going to touch on, which I found absolutely fascinating from a psychological perspective, the Superman Red, Superman Blue storyline. Also in the late 90s, there was a storyline I know people remember where Superman got electric powers and a new blue costume. And towards the end of that storyline, he was split into two, into Superman Red and Superman Blue. And again, at the time, I don't know. I mean, I was a little kid. I mean, I don't know exactly what I thought of it necessarily, but I definitely didn't know the historical context, the background for this. So it was fascinating to see that. And one more example. Very early on in this podcast, we covered the Jeff Loeb era of the Superman books from the early 2000s. And one of their big tentpole storylines was Return to Krypton. And in this reading assignment, I got to see Superman's Silver Age return to Krypton, where he travels back in time and he meets his parents and he falls in love and he almost gets married. So it was really, really cool to see the inspiration for a lot of the stories that I grew up reading. And even if I didn't enjoy the originals all that much, I still appreciate what they added to the mythology and found it, again, to be a very worthwhile endeavor.
okay. I track with all of that, and I'm thrilled that you spoke about other things, whether it was the Jeff Loeb influence or the Dominus or the super. Yeah, I'm excited to go to the original and kind of contrast that with the stories in the 90s. One thing I wanna say, and Anthony, I know this existed, but I've never done any research on it. But in that limbo area you spoke about, that time frame, I know this existed, but I've never even studied it on Wikipedia. But the Wortham, uh, book, The Seduction of the Innocent, and the congressional hearings, for my own self knowledge, probably when I retire, I'd like to study that more because I truly think some of the publishers got so anxious and so concerned that they really did make this much more child friendly versus more of the freedom that, say, Siegel and others had in 1940, when he could be more of an outlaw, more of a champion of the oppressed and a defender, of those against bullies. I wonder how much the Wortham hearings, the congressional hearings and investigations, kind of fostered, like, hey, we look, this is our livelihood. We better, they created the Comics Code Authority, and I wonder if they reacted so intensely that they stifled creativity. Sorry, those are
I'm
those. That's something I thought that occurred to me as you were speaking.
Yeah, I'm sure 100% that that was a big reason for why the violence was toned down and why the stories were so kid friendly. Just as a quick side note, we're still recording, but do you mind, Rich, on your Zoom screen, can you try turning off your video and turning it back on? Because on my end, you've been frozen for the past few minutes. At first, I thought, I'm
Oh,
like, man, he's really absorbing what I'm saying there. He's like stone faced. I was like, I don't know if he likes this or not. So
is
let's
that
see.
better? Am I?
Well, right
Is
now
that my?
I can't see anything at all.
I've got it back on, and my Wi-Fi is strong. I I'm sorry. Let me turn it on and off again, yet again.
Sure.
So I'm
Thank you for bearing
stopping
with
it.
us, audience. We do appreciate it. I while you're playing with that, let me just say that the next the next bunch of recordings will continue to be conducted remotely, but I'm getting more comfortable, and I think we're getting to a point where we're going to start to have in studio recordings where I'm actually face to face in the same room with a guest, and I'm really excited for that. So I think before the year is out, we'll start to have some in studio recordings. So Rich, you are
Okay,
still yeah, you're still, I don't see anything. So actually, you know what? Here's what we're going to do. I am going to pause the recording for a moment.
yeah.
And we're back. Now to our audience, but a moment passed. But for us, it was a few minutes as we tried to sort out some technical issues. You know, Rich, we joke about your lack of connectivity at home, and it's very charming and endearing. But when we're doing these podcasts, man, I sure do wish you weren't just relying on a hotspot. But it's all right. I want to say, and this I know I don't say this to call you out, but for anyone who watches our video podcast, if you're like, hey, this the Rich episodes look different than the other ones.
There's a reason for that.
There's a reason for that. There's a platform that I normally use for my video podcasts. It's called Ecamm. For anyone who's curious, like how I normally do my video podcasts, that's the platform. For some reason, whenever you've tried clicking the link to join the Ecamm session, you're unable to do it. Hence, we're using Zoom here. But the important thing is that we get the episode out to everybody. And I'm happy to be able to do that, whatever it takes.
Cool. I'm focused now.
I want to ask you, we were talking about, the Wortham book and the Senate hearings and how comics generally changed significantly in the 50s. And I want to ask you one more question, and then we'll take a commercial break, and then we'll get into the specific stories that we read. But I'm glad we had this conversation first because I think it really sets the stage, and we'll have some fun with the specific stories that we're going to talk about. But I think that Again, it was really worth it to, to kind of go through everything that we've already talked about. Going back to those golden age stories, right? Superman was born out of this depression era that I would, obviously I didn't live through it, but I would imagine it was a time of a lot of hopelessness and despair for a lot of people. And maybe not unlike our current times living through a pandemic and all the unrest that we've seen. But, I have to imagine that, Superman bursting onto the scene the way he did in 1938 and standing up for the little guy at a time when people really needed it. It's understandable why that version of the character resonated and caught fire so quickly. Jumping ahead now to the late 50s and 60s, the period of time we're talking about where you were reading these comics. Yes, there were the Senate hearings and the Comics Code Authority and all of that, and I know that played a major role. But at the same time, and this is not something I can answer, but maybe you can as someone who grew up in that time. I mean, I guess from TV, movies, the history books. I don't know. I mean, that period of time always seems to be characterized as one of hope and optimism. Like the good guys won World War II. America led the way. America's the new world superpower. We're gonna conquer space. It seemed like it was a time of renewed hope and optimism. And Wortham aside, it kind of feels like these stories and their innocence kind of reflect that. I mean, do you agree with that? What was it like to be growing up during that time?
It was everything you said, right? There was, we were going into space. There was preparation for the moonshot. The Kennedy era, it was called Camelot, right? It was called, so there was a lot of optimism. The Peace Corps was created. Um, I also think it wasn't just, if I may, it wasn't just Superman. I think some other, well, granted, there were other television shows that were for an adult audience, but like The Lone Ranger was basically Superman in the old West with Clayton Moore and John Hart as the Lone Ranger and Jay Silver here heels. So I think the tone of shows for children. I also think, quite frankly, it was a lot of guys who went through World War II or they were in Korea and they were just disgusted by the experiences of war, and they might have gone a little more the other way in trying to protect their children and, just shield them from the horrors of the real world, so to speak. So I think it was all those things. It was the optimism. America was, the leader of the free world, technology, the jet age, a lot of things commingled. Kennedy with his charisma and just the inspiration and the leading of for the future, the best and the brightest, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, that all makes sense and that all tracks, and it, further kind of feeds into what I think has become a theme on the show as we talk about the evolution of the character and that, each generation kind of gets the Superman that it needs and that reflects the times, and so yeah, and so I think all of that does make sense. And I will say, while these Silver Age stories were not especially gripping or enthralling, there was for sure a certain charm and a comfort in reading these. I will say, even as an adult in 2021 reading these stories, there was something like oddly reassuring about them. And I would
Yeah.
imagine that's part of the reason why, they appeal to so many back in the day.
Yeah.
So,
And
yeah.
one more thing before we take the break, or we can pick it up when you come back, but I would like to talk about all the parts of the mythos. I mean, the fortress, became like, my God, like a world unto itself. Uh, they started mining and expanding things like Lois Lane got her own title. Jimmy Olsen got his own title. They started doing more and more for the backstory with Lex Luthor. They really Supergirl got her own running title, and they built the backstory into all these characters. And I was going to say, and I'll bring it up, robots almost became a subgenre by itself. That guy had more sentient robots I mean, he made Doctor Doom look like a piker with his robots.
These robots. I know you have a lot to say. I have a decent bit to say. These robots, man. All right, we'll pick up the robots a little bit down the line. In the meantime, let's take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. If you enjoy this show, please make sure you subscribe, rate, and review. I also hope you'll consider joining my Patreon community. The support of my patrons enables me to produce this podcast, and patrons get rewards too, including exclusive episodes, advanced listens, and more. Sign up today and get instant access to the back catalog. Visit patreon.com/Anthony Desiato. Thank you to all of my patrons. I truly appreciate your support. Hive Comics and Games is an oasis of nerd fun and events in the heart of Odessa, Texas. Whether it's comic book superhero stories or role-playing in a dungeon, the Hive is where to be. Come tap your mana and face off against the top Magic the Gathering players in West Texas. Hive carries a majority of new comic titles each Wednesday and has all of your favorite titles in their back issue section. Follow them on Facebook at The Hive Comics and on Instagram at The Hive Comic Shop. Film lovers and filmmakers should check out this family of film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and In the Cut in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals generally, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Also, be sure to listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. I also just want to take a quick moment and share that I've continued to connect with other fellow Superman podcasters, which has been absolutely terrific. It's great to talk to other people like myself who are doing this, and each show really has its own flavor and comes at Superman from a different angle. And I want to share a little message from another Superman podcaster or Superboy podcaster with our audience.
Hey, digging for Kryptonite fans. This is Sam Rizzo from Superboy The Legacy. I want to tell you about my podcast. It's a live stream / podcast hosted by me and my team of Superboy enthusiasts. The show is a tribute to the live action Superboy the TV series from the late 80s and early 90s. On the podcast series, me and my team examine and discuss all 100 episodes, conduct all new interviews with members of the cast and crew, and we look at Superboy the character across other media. The podcast series is available on all major podcast platforms, along with being available on the Superboy Legacy website at superboylegacy.com.
All right, and we're back. So that was a message from Sam, host of Superboy The Legacy podcast. And you will likely hear Sam maybe on this podcast down the line. He and I have been chatting, and Rich, as I've shared with you, and I think I've mentioned this on episodes, I am planning a bit of a deep dive into Superboy, just as we've been looking at Superman and the evolution. I want to spend some time with Superboy, and we'll probably get to that next year. So yeah, a lot of great Superman podcasts out there, and I encourage you to check out Superboy The Legacy. So, okay, we're back. Do you want to dive into our the first item on our list here? Action 241, 1956, the super key to Fort Superman.
Yes, and once again, you're better at it than me. So if you could give the synopsis.
I think, for the most part, because we have a decent number to get through, and I don't want to get bogged down in like full plot summaries for all of these. So I think the basic setup is fine. And for this, Superman is spending time at his Fortress of Solitude. And this is, I did a little research. I believe that there were earlier iterations of the fortress, but this was like like full on Fortress of Solitude and establishing the
Right.
version that we'll see moving forward. So he's spending time in the fortress conducting experiments and such, and he finds out that someone has broken in and is leaving messages, and he has to figure out who has infiltrated this sacred space. Now, I'll toss it to you, and I want to get your thoughts on this, but I know for the most part, I shared what I liked about this era earlier. Let me pivot now and share why ultimately it was hard for me to connect with Silver Age Superman, because this story, I mean, a lot of them, but this story in particular completely represents the main issue that I had. And it's not even so much a criticism. Like, I just recognize that it was a different take on the character and a different iteration. It's just not one that really responded to me. And I'm going to use an unexpected example, but I know you're familiar with the television series Friends. Yes. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
So there's this episode early on where Phoebe acts as Joey's agent for the episode. And towards the end of the episode, she has to deliver all of the negative feedback that Joey has gotten from casting directors on the various auditions he's gone for. And one of one of the pieces of feedback that Phoebe has to deliver is that they didn't feel Joey was believable as a person. And I use this example because this Silver Age Superman, to me, is not really believable as a person. He comes across as so aloof and removed from humanity. And this
Yeah.
story encapsulates that because, he's so excited that he has a night to himself and he can spend it at his Arctic hideaway conducting experiments, testing his powers, building these shrines to the people in his life. And again, it just is so divorced from the version of the character that most resonates with me. And that big picture, more than anything else, more than the heavy exposition, more than the clunky dialogue, more than, the childlike innocence of these stories, that was what was hardest for me about connecting with Silver Age Superman.
I can totally appreciate that. Totally understand. I mean, you used the word removed, right? And boy, he went up there and basically closed the door. And for your listeners, and I hope they all know this, that the Silver Age Fortress of Solitude was in the Arctic. There was this humongous key that was basically the ulterior motive was it was going to be if a plane was ever flying over, it was going to give a directional signal as to where they should go. So this huge key that only he could lift that would unlock this door that must have been 5 or 6 stories tall. Um, the interesting thing was that was the first fortress story in the Silver Age, the first one. And then if I could say real fast, and I want to let you dig into this more, the immediate next issue of Action was written by Otto Binder, and that story introduced the bottle city of Condor. And to my thinking, they kind of needed this fortress story first because they needed a place. I mean, it's not like he could put this huge, tiny bottle in his apartment. Well, maybe he could in the closet with the robots. Maybe they could protect it. But it seemed to me, and then the two were just intrinsically related thereafter. So I agree with your comments on, and his journal. I still don't understand that journal. That was like, you tell your audience about how he would record in his diary.
Right. He would use, well, now was it his heat vision or his finger nails or both over the course of the story? Do you remember?
I thought it was heat vision.
It was yeah.
Maybe
I'm
it was
pretty
his.
sure.
Maybe it was his. Maybe it was both.
I feel like it was later in that story. Maybe it was a different story where they talked about his fingernails. But yeah, at the very least, there's definitely an image of him using his heat vision to inscribe, his journal here. And here's the thing. Again, I feel like this is, I don't know if I would go so far as to say if you're only going to read one Silver Age story, read this one, but it really does set the stage and the tone for the Silver Age. And, again, it's like the Fortress of Solitude is such an indelible part of the mythology. I mean, really, I'm currently watching Superman and Lois, and in the latest episode, Clark and Lois's son was poisoned by kryptonite, and they had to take him to the fortress and burn it out of him. Like it's such a part of the mythology, and so it was cool to see it and to see it get so much play. And there were a lot of cool ideas. I mean, the intergalactic zoo, that Superman keeps. So there were a lot of cool ideas, and it added a lot. But again, he just felt so removed from his humanity. And the kicker to the story is, we find out that it was Batman who had snuck in and was leaving all these messages. He was playing with Superman to celebrate the anniversary of their first team up. Now, my favorite part of the story, and it's so minor, but man, it made me laugh. And I have to tell you, and the audience as well. I came downstairs to Flat Squirrel Studios for most of this reading, and I was like cackling at least one point in every issue that I read. And I remember coming back upstairs and my wife was like, "What are you laughing at?" And I was like, "Oh my God, I'm reading these Silver Age Superman stories." I'm like, they're nuts. Like there's all this goofy stuff in there. But my favorite
And
part from this story,
Anthony,
yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We really didn't even touch on the silly ones. I mean, there were stories where Superman used red kryptonite and gave himself the head of an ant, and he would lead all the ants on Earth to fool some alien species. There was stories where he had the body of a lion, right? Um, yeah, these were some of the more toned down ones. I mean, those guys must have been doing acid to write some of these the other stories.
Yeah, and well, so two things. One, it would have been unrealistic, but also impossible to try to, read everything, right? I say impossible because, as a side note, it was exceedingly frustrating how little was available on the DC app or in collected edition. As much as there have been, trade paperback and hardcover collections of, Silver Age Superman stories, very few of them are still in print. And the DC app is exceedingly spotty. And it was a real source of frustration. I mean, you and I both ended up using Superman Through the Ages website, and I, they have like entire issues of Superman just on their website. And unless they have some sort of deal with DC, which I doubt, I don't know that they're necessarily supposed to do that, but I appreciate that it's available because it's the only place you could read a lot of these stories. Anyway, that's a whole other rant. But on the note of like like the writers doing acid or whatever, it's funny because I was reading these stories and I mean, as you know, like I don't get high, but I thought to myself, I was like, if I did, I'd probably get high and read these stories and they would be like awesome. Like I was reading a lot of these. I'm like, yeah, like if you were kind of coming to these in an altered state, I think you'd have a really good time.
Oh my God. Oh, Anthony, and if I may, I apologize. I interrupted you, and you were
It,
just on the moment of talking about what made you laugh out of this story. I hope it's the same thing as me. So,
I
uh,
don't know. We'll find out. But it's when Batman is explaining, everything that he did and why he did it, and he talks about how, it was so hard to find a good gift. And we have this flashback. It's like just a panel, but it's Batman like at a store searching for a gift for Superman. And when you and I talked about your first comic, that issue of World's Finest, we talked about it on an episode of my other podcast, My Comic Shop History. And we talked about it then, and I'll briefly, I give a short version of it now. As much as Superman has changed a lot over the years,
oh,
man, has
yeah.
Batman changed a lot. And so it's whenever Batman appears in these various stories, it's really shocking because it's so divorced from the Batman of modern era. And so the fact that Batman would be gifting Superman anything, let alone shopping at a store, really kind of takes a minute to get acclimated to that. That made me laugh in that issue. What was it for you?
Okay, there were two things that made me laugh. Two. Uh, the first was how Superman pulled a sneaky trick on Batman. Like, hey, there's an avalanche and I'm trapped in here. Oh, it looks, this kryptonite came right next to me. And there's no way you can move it far enough away that I'll regain my strength. So we're both going to die, right? And while we're waiting to die, why don't you tell me how you got in here? So I thought that was funny. But the cake, the very final panel of the story, they're in the Batcave, and somehow Batman made this cake that was effectively the size of a fire engine. I mean, Superman had like a 12-foot knife to cut the thing. Alfred must have been baking for months.
Yeah, poor Alfred. That's true. And Superman, I think Batman says like, I don't know if it's very good. And Superman's like, it's okay. I can eat through steel. Yeah. Again, very
The
unintentionally humorous. I don't know, but yeah, I
Well,
mean,
the
a
other thing
pivotal
that
issue.
was really pivotal issue because it was foundational. It was foundational. And like I said, it gave them a place where they could store what we're going to chat about in the next story, the Bottle City of Condor. But the other thing that was weird was, and in retrospect, the whole Silver Age was really creepy. Like Batman or Superman had all these rooms of statues, mannequins of his friends, and he made like a car for Jimmy. I'm like, when I die, Jimmy's going to get this sports car.
Yes. Oh, wait, can we
And
talk
then,
about that? Can we talk about that for just 2 seconds? Now I'm interrupting you and I apologize, but that caught my attention too. It's like, why can't you give Jimmy the car now so he can enjoy it? Like,
right. And didn't
this-
he make pearls for
Yeah.
Lois, a necklace? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if they knew about that, they'd probably, it'd be like cashing in on his life insurance policy. Let's kill the old guy now and get the gifts. But the creepiness. And then I think he even goes, you know what? If anybody ever breaks in here, I'm going to have a Clark Kent room so they're not able to connect the dots on my identity. One, you're going to be dead, so who's going to care? But it was just kind of creepy. Let me have all these monuments.
I'm with you. And again, look, it's very easy for us with the benefit of decades and all the stories we've read since to really kind of pick on these, but it's so funny to me. It's like, maybe instead of building a Lois Lane statue, why don't you take the woman out to dinner? Good Lord. It's so funny to me. But again, I know it was a different time. But yeah, I mean, so that's our big Fortress of Solitude. And the next issue introduces Brainiac, and most of the issue is Superman and Brainiac battling. Brainiac has this impenetrable force field, and he's in the process of shrinking major American cities. But like you said, I mean, this introduces the bottle city of, I say Condor. I know you say Condor. I don't know which pronunciation is really meant to be the official one, but it introduces the bottle city, which is along with Brainiac. I mean, these are two really key pieces. There's one thing that I zeroed in on, and then I want to toss it to you because I think you probably have different takeaways from this issue, but there's a point where Superman just can't get through that force field. I mean, there's nothing he can do. He's losing against Brainiac. And so he puts on this whole show. We find out it's a show where he basically gives up, right? And he returns to Metropolis, but it turns out he only did that because he knew Brainiac would shrink the city and that would be his way to get through the force field. So it's clever.
Mm.
It's clever. But as I was reading it, I thought like, wow, how interesting would it be? Like, what if he genuinely thought he couldn't win? And maybe he actually was scared. It's like, again, I know that's not the territory like these stories would ever get into. But as I was reading it, I'm like, man, I feel like that would have been really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I was more impressed, or what resonated with me or stayed with me was, and this is where I salute Otto Binder because he was planning for the future. He introduced other Kryptonians, and that opened the door for future stories. But the Bottle City, I hope I'm saying it right. The Bottle City of Condor, that didn't appear till like midway in the story. It wasn't on the cover. It wasn't at the beginning of the story. But here it's become so intrinsic and so definitively related to the entire mythos. It's still with us now. But it was almost like, hey, midpoint. Oh, by the way, I got this Kryptonian city. I'm going to put it next to the Paris with the Eiffel Tower.
Yeah, they kind of buried the lead a little bit, but yeah, the Bottle City will definitely get a lot of play, in a ton of subsequent stories, including a number of the other ones that we're going to discuss here. One of the earlier episodes of this podcast that I did was with V. Ken Marion. We talked about the Godfall storyline from the mid 2000s in the Superman books, and it was all about Condor. So again, even well, that's not to this day, but it's still continued to get a lot of play. But actually, on that note, I wanted to mention something about the passage of time because I was thinking about this. This is a bit of a tangent, but I think it's an important one. I guess I was thinking about how large the Silver Age looms in Superman lore, and clearly it established a lot that is still being used. That's undeniable. But in terms of how much of an influence it still is today, I was really thinking about this, and in my mind, I always think of myself as coming to Superman relatively recently, right? But when I do the math, I mean, I've been reading Superman, I'm coming up on 30 years, 3 decades. And so when I was a kid in the 90s reading these comics, and at the beginning of this episode, right, I mentioned a lot of the stories I read in the 90s that took their cues from Silver Age stories. And I think that, a lot of the comics, in the 90s, right, were written by people who probably came up on the Silver Age stories, and that was a big thing for them. And, in my mind, certainly, growing up, that I don't know, I always felt like the Silver Age loomed large. But I was thinking about it. I mean, now as we're in 2021, like if you talk to a relatively new young comic creator and ask who their influences are, it's probably Jeff Johns. It's not Otto Binder.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
do kind of like, I wonder, and I would be curious. And, for people who are listening or watching, I would love to hear from you because, especially for people on the younger side, I mean, I'm 34. So for people my age and younger in particular, like I would be curious. I mean, I don't know how big of a deal is Silver Age to people now. I don't have an answer for that, but I was kind of wondering about that.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to bring this up later in the discussion, but you could see, I mean, I'll talk about it real fast. Some of the sales numbers for Superman in 1961 and 62. I mean, I think Superman in 1962, on average, it sold 740,000 copies of an issue on average for that year. And then DC quit publishing their numbers in 1963 in the mid 60s. And I think some of that Marvel came on strong. And the sensibilities changed a little bit. But as you say, so many of these things that we're going to speak about now uh, were established then, and then they evolved and were mined. And like you said, someone now is going to look back 20 years, not really connected to what I'm speaking about, nor what Siegel and Otto Binder and others wrote in the late 40s or even earlier in time. But as you've said other times, this is really a tribute to the legacy and the power of Superman and how it's been prevalent for 80 years.
Exactly. And I said this in the last episode, and it bears repeating and revisiting and kind of reapplying now because the character has to evolve to endure for over 80 years. I don't think there's any way otherwise. And I said in the last episode, that earliest iteration that I fell in love with, the rebel outlaw Superman, if not for that strong start, I don't know that there's a character to stick around, to endure. But I would apply that again here and say that, Silver Age Superman, again, while the stories might not have, you know, blown me away necessarily, if not for those stories and the fact that
Right.
they allowed the character to stick around at a time when comics were under fire, and they introduced all of these elements of the mythology that are still being used. Again, if not for this period that we're talking about, yeah, I don't know that the character exists today or in the
Right.
same way at least.
Right. And we have some laughter at some of the panels and the plot lines and the statements. But you're exactly right. If those stories in the early 1960s were not successful, I mean, how many other characters? e- Even you look at Captain Marvel, created by Otto Binder. I mean, now that poor guy, they can't even figure out what name to properly call him. Other characters have come and gone. Um, so it really is a tribute. And you know what? These guys probably figured, look, Wortham came on strong. We do have a good character. Let's change it so we adapt to the times. It was probably both enjoyable creatively, but also valuable on a business level in terms of profit and revenue.
Yeah, 100%. And, we keep referencing like all these elements, right? And again, right at the top, we have the Fortress, Brainiac, Supergirl. There's other aspects that we're not necessarily touching on in the stories that we read, but Bizarro and the variety of Kryptonite. And actually,
Yeah, six.
one of the stories we will talk about is this past between Luther and Superboy, which was out of the comics for a while, then came back. Obviously, it was the bedrock of the Smallville TV series, which an entire generation of fans, including this guy, grew up reading, grew up watching and knowing. So, yeah, there's a lot of elements, the ones that we're talking about, but others as well. Um, you mentioned the fact that this age introduced all these other Kryptonians. So of course the Bottle City, and then the next issue that we have is Supergirl. The other, I guess, another hallmark of this era is that there were more trips to Krypton, and one of the stories we'll talk about is Return to Krypton. I'm kind of torn on this because on the one hand, I guess I understand the instinct from a storytelling point of view to want to explore the Kryptonian heritage and to actually send Superman to Krypton in the past and to bring these other people to the current storylines. But at the same time, I think I see why post-crisis they stripped all of that away. Because I think that, the whole last survivor of a doomed planet bit loses its impact when he's surrounded by all these other Kryptonians. I mean, was it
Yes,
like
yes.
at the time though, as a kid? I mean, was that like, were you, to whatever extent you remember, and I know we're going back a long time, but I mean, were you happy and excited to meet all these other Kryptonians, or at a certain point did it feel like, hey, this is probably a bit much?
Well, both, both. I can remember reading certain stories where earlier in the 60s, when they would add new elements and new layers to it. Uh, like you said, first there was green kryptonite, then there was red, and then finally there was six colors of kryptonite, right? Um, it was fascinating how they added to the lore and the myth, like on Krypton itself, the Jewel Mountains, or certain animals. There were certain animals that I think were looked like perhaps like a rhinoceros, but it had like a big forehead that could show you what you were thinking or what was going to happen in the future or something. There was the Kryptonian flame dragons and stuff like that, and uh, so they added incrementally to the lore. I mean, even in Condor, uh, there was Van Z, who was Superman's second cousin, who was almost a twin to Superman. Later on, he became Nightwing of the Nightwing and Flamebird. Uh, so they incrementally added, and that was fascinating. I remember reading stories about Kryptonian flame dragons or some of the civil wars on Krypton. Um, their society, their credos, their social mores. It was fascinating. But then, candidly, two things happened. I aged. I came to appreciate more what Marvel was doing, where they were showing characters like Peter Parker, who even though he would do very courageous things, he still couldn't pay the rent. So there was the emotional tug. Um, I also think I don't want to say they jumped the shark, but they did so much of this, it became almost no other place to go, right? Uh, so while it was powerful at certain points in its moment, candidly, after 12 years of these sort of stories, it just kind of really got played out.
Right. And, and again, the next episode that we're going to be doing is Bronze Age. And, I'm curious to see how the character further evolves there. I'm particularly curious about that era because I know what happens post crisis, but we still have this Bronze Age in between. And so, uh, so I am curious, to see that first. But, yeah, I mean, everything that you're saying makes sense. And you mentioned Mort Weisinger, and he was really, I mean, the editor at the time, but really, a guiding creative force for all of this. Is it fair to say that it really there really wasn't much of an attempt to reconcile the Golden Age iteration? And I know ultimately the Golden Age character would be repositioned as the Superman of Earth 2, but I mean, it was almost sort of like almost like a blank slate, right? From the
You're
Silver Age
right.
forward.
No, and in preparing for our discussion, I read some stuff, and Weisinger was a Superman editor really in the late 40s. He started. And then something happened in 1958 where they consolidated a number of Superman titles together. So his purview became broader. He had all Superman titles. And then apparently he got a lot of resistance when he wanted to do Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen in their standalone titles. But oh my God, the numbers they were getting for those titles, like Lois Lane was getting 500,000 uh, issues per month, or per issue, printed version. Jimmy Olsen was getting like 475,000. So the numbers, I mean, this was a moneymaker. But to your point, I also wanted to say this. I think there was such consistency, right? You had Mort Weisinger. He had his staff of writers. You had Otto Binder. You had Jerry Siegel, and I really do. In a couple of issues, we're going to talk about Superman 149, and boy, have I got thoughts on that. Um, Critical, valuable thoughts. But you had this stable of writers, whether it's Binder, Siegel, Leo Dorfman, Edmund Hamilton is my favorite. And then you had consistency in artists. You had Wayne Boring, you had Al Plastino, and especially Kurt Swan. So there was phenomenal consistency for a good 12 years. Most of these stories, one of those three artists drew almost all of them. I can't think of any other Superman artist in that 12-year time span.
Yeah. No, it's very true. I mean, definitely that high level of consistency. I mean, it's a very once we actually get into the Silver Age, I do think it's a very well defined period of the character. Um, and yeah, those sales numbers are definitely staggering. A couple of follow up thoughts. You mentioned Lois, and Lois. There are certain characters that we've kind of been touching on in these episodes, like Lois and like Lex, and probably like Jimmy as well. And I plan more of a deep dive into them in the future because I think there's enough there to really get deeper. I don't think the Silver Age did Lois any favors. I was thinking back to the Golden Age, like her first appearance. We meet her and she's kind of stuck writing the love advice column, but she wants to be an investigative reporter, and she gets there. And even in the sillier stories to follow in the Golden Age, like there's one where this this therapist tells her she has to transfer her feelings of love for Superman to someone who's more attainable, and she settles on Clark. And so she's like throwing herself at Clark the whole issue, and Clark is like, I can't have this is getting in the way of me being Superman. And so the way he is able to kind of divert her is by scooping a story out from under her, and that sets her off because that matters to her. And so that was a silly story that in and of itself, the premise of that, again, that Golden Age story, that wasn't doing Lois any favors. But the fact that she still cared so much about getting the story, I think that came through. And again, even going back to the beginning when she's doing the love column and she wants more, she's breaking the mold. Even the fact that she's just out there working at that period of time as a single woman, I think was really ahead of its time. But the fact that she aspired for more and broke that ground, and in at least the stories we read, I mean, she does little more than pine for Superman, and I think it really did a disservice to her.
I agree. And I don't think it's just Lois.
Right.
I think there was a common response by the people at DC, the publishers, whether it's Julius Schwartz or Weisinger or others, they were very misogynistic. I mean, they almost, they were very, very misogynistic. They did not really let women grow, or it was also in some ways, I hate to say, the tenor of the times. Women were not in the workforce, or they were secretaries or stenographers. But it did a definite disservice to Lois, where I'm thrilled about some of the things you and I have discussed, about more of the stories in the 90s, about when they got married, And even when we did our Superman 2000 script, we thought that was a much better outcome by not adapting that script. So I agree with you. I mean, the stories were so child oriented. Probably in the moment it sold issues, but in hindsight they don't stand up well.
Yeah, I think with Lois in particular, the thing that kind of breaks my heart is that, she was a trailblazer initially, and I feel like she lost some ground in this period of time. It's funny too, because when you and I talked about Adventures of Superman, and we did many hours on that, so I won't rehash the whole thing, but there was a change in actress from Phyllis Coates to Noel Neal between seasons 1 and 2 of the show. And the Phyllis Coates version of Lois was tough as nails,
Feistier.
real feisty. And as much as I love Noel Neal, and I think she did a lovely job over the rest of the series, it was definitely a softer,
more demure,
daintier, version of Lois. And that kind of then lines up with what we see later on in this era. The other thing I want to follow up with, because I think this is such an important piece. You mentioned kind of losing interest and being more interested in a character like Spider-Man, right? And Spider-Man, of course, is that everyman, right? He's going through all of these personal struggles while trying to also be a superhero. There's a relatability aspect. And that was, I guess, the other thing. And this ties back to my overall problem with this more aloof, godlike Superman. I guess it's more inspirational slash aspirational. It's like he's infinitely kind and patient and good, and he always knows what to do. And I don't know, I guess maybe for a certain time and a certain audience, that might be the right approach. I don't know. That might be what you want to see in your superhero. But I far more gravitate to the version of the character who doesn't always have the right answers, doesn't always do the right thing. He's just a guy, at at the end of the day, it's like, he's just a guy, like, trying to do the right thing. And so I like a version of Superman who doesn't always have the right answers, but and again, for you growing up reading these, I mean, I don't know, maybe there was that comfort in that. Not so much like, oh, I identify with what he's going through, like you might with Spider-Man. Like, hey, I got to pick up the eggs and also, do well on my tests, But maybe there's more of that aspect of like, oh, I want to be like Superman because he always knows what to do. So again, it's like, it doesn't necessarily, it's not what I want out of Superman, but I guess I get why that would be an approach.
yes, I can. You said it so well. And Anthony, I'll tell you this: the stories I loved, like I love the Last Days of Superman. Uh, s- uh, the world's finest stories, where Superman and Batman were best friends. I love the Kurt Swan artwork. But you're right. He's not stunned. He's not mentally staggered. He doesn't have things that he really has to figure out. How am I going to handle this? He's thoughtful. He's concerned. He's courageous. He's very confident. Right? He's got the answer. So my readings from say 1962 or 1964. By the early 70s, I was really into Marvel. I mean, there was a lot of Roy Thomas stuff I was reading, or the Avengers Kree Skrull War, because I was a little bit older. Instead of being 10, I was 15 and 16. So I wanted more thoughtful stories that were more representative of what I was experiencing at that point in my life. Um, and I think we can. I don't want to do a disservice to your audience. We could probably debate this for hours and hours and hours and hours, and we still probably would still have philosophical thoughts. Um, but you're right. I think it was a disservice to Lois. They almost made Lois and Jimmy comedic relief or caricatures. Um, but hey, certain things that were done have been intrinsic to what we're seeing now. And fortunately, they survived, and current writers are able to let it breathe or let it expand and stuff like that.
And I think that's a critical piece to all of this, where it lays the groundwork, both, I guess, positively in terms of the additive elements that we've been talking about, but also, negatively might not be the right word, but a lot of the great stories that we've read in maybe in more modern times, were informed by these stories, right? And so you have people growing up who maybe wished that Lois or Jimmy had more dimension to them, and then they write those stories, So again, it really is an evolution, and it's a layering. And so again, I kept checking myself throughout this process and reminding myself that these stories really that there's value there, even maybe in ways that maybe you don't necessarily see right off the top. I'm dying to get to that issue of Jimmy Olsen, but before that, is there anything from the Supergirl, the introduction of Supergirl that you
Oh,
wanted to talk about?
yeah, I do. I do. The things I'll say, and before I've got 3 comments, but why don't you give a much better synopsis than I do? So why
We
don't you give a
we
quick.
meet Supergirl. A rocket crashes. Superman investigates, and it's Kara Zor-El, his cousin from Krypton. Her city of Argo escaped Krypton's destruction. Uh, they were able to survive in space. They were able to survive the effects of kryptonite by lining the ground beneath them with like lead shielding. But eventually their their time ran out, and her father sent her to Earth. So I mean that's the basic setup. I mean it introduces Kara Zor-El. I mean a major player in the Superman mythology. For years she operated in secret as his secret weapon before he finally introduced her to the world. But there's one thing that makes me laugh about this issue. But I want to let you go first. What stands out to you?
Uh, Probably the 3 things I'll say. Again, this was a profound step by Binder to introduce more Kryptonians. In reading the story now, my God, they were so mean and harsh and almost uncaring. I mean, here you've got this, in reading it now, you've got this poor girl who was rocketed away, but she was basically 15, right? So she had enough going on. She wasn't a 2-year-old or an infant because that varied with Superman. But she's now stranded on a new world. She's an alien. She's a 15-year-old. Superman basically places her in the Midvale orphanage. So in reading it now, I was so sympathetic to all the stresses that poor girl must have been going through at that point in her life. Here, she's rocketed to Metropolis. She's wearing a costume identical to her cousin's. She's trying to track down Superman. You know, we're 2 people from a destroyed world. Hopefully you can help me in my new world. Nope, he just drops her off at an orphanage, which is a common theme with Kryptonians, right? um, but I did feel great sympathy. That must, I do think other writers could have, in today's world, could have mined that uh, much more. So I felt great sympathy for that. But the other thing that was only in this reading, because Anthony, when I was younger, I knew Supergirl through other stories. So when I read this Action 252, it really didn't alarm me. But reading it for an academic purpose made me think about what she must be experiencing. So when I first read the story, it didn't mean anything to me because I knew of her and I knew about Argo City and I knew about her father and I knew that they were cousins. So this was just like, okay, I can check the box. Now I understand the first story. But reading it academically or reading it critically now made me conscious of the fact that, wow, emotionally, that they could have portrayed that as being very, very hard.
Yeah, it's like she's a real good sport. She just goes right along with it. I mean, that's the thing that made me laugh about this, where she wants to come live with Superman, and he's basically like, nah, I can't deal with this. I think he has a thought to himself about, oh, this will interfere with my Clark Kent identity or some nonsense like that. But the way and maybe orphanages had conjured a different image back in the day. I doubt it. I mean, but the way he presents the idea of an orphanage, you would think he was telling her like, you're going to Disneyland, kid. It was just like, it so made me laugh how he presented it. He presented the idea of the orphanage as such a positive to her. He's like, you can't come live with me, but I've got something even better. You're going to live in an orphanage. And she goes right along with that. I mean, of course, what else does she know? But oh my God, I can't believe I forgot this. But that sparked a memory. I got to jump back to the Brainiac story. And when Superman enters the bottle city of Condor for the first time, and he meets one of the Kryptonian scientists, and he introduces himself as Kal-El, son of Jor-El, and the scientist goes, "Oh, Jor-El? Why, he was my roommate in college."
Right.
It just just made me laugh. It's like, oh, I didn't realize Krypton had the same educational and housing system as Earth. Anyway, but so yeah, so he so sells Kara on this idea of the orphanage, and it ends up being this like dilapidated,
It's a
rundown
dump.
room, and she has to use her powers to
Yeah.
like fuse the
Yeah.
broken mirror shards together. But you know,
sweep the place out, and then fix the broken the leg in the broken bed.
exactly. You know, I know that you haven't followed the Supergirl TV series, but in that show, Superman brings Kara to a family. There's a scientist named Jeremiah Danvers who he had worked with, and that's who he brings Kara to. So, he doesn't dump her at an orphanage, but some of the character, one of the, I don't know if it's Jimmy Olsen later on in the series, does kind of like call Superman out for that. Like he says to Kara, he's like, Superman just like dumped you there. So there is
really?
that element, like, again, I guess I'm going to undermine what I just said about Superman always being in the Silver Age, always being, kind and good. It's like, this was kind of a dick move. I mean, if we're being perfectly honest, and it's not his only one in this period of time.
Yeah, but to counter that, or to give a different perspective, this was 1958, right?
True.
His frame of reference, his core cast was Perry, Jimmy, and Lois, friends with Batman. The Justice League hadn't even been formed. His parents were dead. I really don't think the publishers of DC wanted a single man having a 15-year-old girl living with him, in an apartment. So I don't know what other options they really would have had.
Yeah, I don't disagree, but I do think your point about there being unexamined trauma there is a very salient point. Can we jump to Jimmy Olsen 37?
Go read it. Please.
This story
I forced you to read this to give me an entree to the robot subgenre.
Yeah, Superman's super rival. This made me laugh because so it's a Jimmy Olsen story. This is, at this point, this is the only Jimmy Olsen story I've ever read, interestingly enough, from his solo title, I mean. But the basic premise is that this new hero with a bandaged face named Mysterio, interestingly, arrives on the scene and, basically declares himself Jimmy Olsen's new protector. And Superman is baffled by who this person could be and why he's keeping his identity a secret. And the reveal is that it's a a long lost Superboy robot, who essentially wants to take Jimmy Olsen's place, but not in a sinister way. He plans to like give Jimmy all these diamonds and send him off on the vacation of a lifetime, and basically take over as Jimmy Olsen, as Superman's pal, continuing in this role that he enjoyed when he served Superman when he was a boy. The thing that was so funny to me about this, and yes, we do start to get into the whole robot bit, but the thing that was so funny to me was, like, I get Superman being mystified, pun intended, by the identity of the person under the bandages, but I don't get why it would be such a big deal for someone else to save Jimmy. Like, why?
Yeah.
Why does it was weird. It's like, why does it matter so much to you that you're the one he calls with the signal watch? Don't you have anything better to do? We know how much you love doing your experiments in the Fortress of Solitude. It's like, that made me laugh. That was the funniest thing to me about that. But what stood out to you? And do you want to get into the bit about the robots now?
Well, yeah, we might as well. So, I'm going to repeat I said this earlier. Let me give the backdrop. So here you had Mysterio, who was a Superboy robot, right? And I think the last line, the very last panel, was something like, after Superman has taken this robot, he tried to deactivate and shit can all these robots, right? And then apparently some mole hit the Superboy robot a certain way. Mysterio wanted to get back into Superman's life. For robots, there's a lot of emotion. And then Superman basically said, you know what? You were the first robot I built that was capable of self-thought. I'm gonna retrofit you now and make you one of my Superman robots, you know. I'll transplant your programming. And then the last panel is something like, oh, Superman, if a robot could express love, I would be weeping tears of joy, right? As he's shoving him in some closet with 4 other robots. But Anthony, there were other stories. There was a story later on. It was on my list and I deliberately plugged it in. It was one of the more highly acclaimed stories, but it was a story about Wonder Man.
Yes.
Yeah, Superman's. And did you get a chance to even peruse that?
I read the entire thing because I know you, because I wrote to you and I was like, I think I've read as much as I'm going to read for this. And you were like, if you haven't done Wonder Man, you know, read that one. So I did. Yes.
Okay. So once again, he's got another robot. I think this was Ajax, this robot. There was there were 2 other robots I read as a boy. There was X1. And then even far later in time, there was another story where Superman got tired of his robots and decided he was going to start building androids. So he was building this android up in the fortress. There was some big explosion, and the android got hurled behind this lead shielding. Superman thought the robot was destroyed. So the robot had got propelled behind this lead shielding. Superman leaves the fortress after this explosion. The robot is vindictive and angry that Superman abandoned him. So the robot comes back and plays, like, basically gaslights Superman. Somehow when Superman's asleep, he puts these Kryptonian shoes on him that nullify his powers. And then the robot comes in and starts supplanting him. You know, he goes into Clark Kent and reveals himself as Superman. So he was resentful that he was abandoned. This Superman has more sentient, emotional robots who are capable of autonomous thought. It just blows my mind. Getting back to the story, the story about Wonder Man, this was a situation where a Superman robot was sent out to do some mission in space. It was really a setup by some villains, the Superman Revenge Squad or some other villains that wanted to destroy Superman. They realized it's a robot. They knock out, I think, the rockets on his back, and somehow the aliens transplant the Superman robot into this android body. They convince him he's human. I did like. As a child, I loved this story and I had this issue. I really liked the nobility of the character. I mean, I did like the few panels where Superman and Wonder Man teamed up. And for a panel or two, Superman was excited, like, hey, you know, we can do a lot of good together. They were both very optimistic and very positive. And then in like the last 2 panels, Wonder Man gets him and goes, hey, I need to tell you something. I'm going to be dead in like 12 hours. But he was very optimistic, very noble. He sacrificed himself to do good things. And then the last panel, we reset the status quo, and there's a memorial or a shrine to Wonder Man, you know, born a robot, but he died a man. But again, this guy's got more done-in-one robots that are capable of self-thought and autonomy. Like I said, he makes Doc Doom look like a piker.
Well said. And, you know, even just from these 2 robot stories that I read, the Superman Super Rival from Jimmy Olsen, and then the Wonder Man story that you described, I guess one takeaway is when a new mysterious superhero debuts and we don't know who it is, and there really aren't any clues in the story, probably a robot, probably one of the robots. The thing is, I just don't like the idea of the robots generally. And we talked about this when we did our origins discussion, right? And that Superboy story, or the Superman origin story, but
Sure.
it's during the Superboy sequence. where, the Kents are discovering all the powers that Superboy has and they're rolling with the punches. And I was fine with that. And then all of a sudden, Superboy's like, oh, to, protect my secret identity, I've created all these robots. And Pa's like, well, that's great. That's where the story lost me. It's like, you found the kid in a rocket, you figure something's up, the powers you can kind of make sense of. But the fact that all of a sudden he's building these fully functional robots, it lost me. And also, again, not to belabor the point, but just this idea of him being removed from humanity. It's like there's way too much going on. He engages with robots like far too much, I think, at the expense of actual, human relationships. But yeah, I mean, they were definitely a staple of the time. The other funny thing about the Jimmy Olsen storyline, right, was that the robot was able to have his face fully bandaged because he had relocated his eyes
Yep.
to his knees.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
That made a lot of sense.
There was that clever bit. And then again, he he pulled the same not trick, but the same bit on the Superboy robot that he
Yep.
did with Supergirl, where he's like, I know what would be the best fate for you. You'll love this. He like shoves them in a closet with all these robots, these other Superman robots. But to your point, he loved it. He was happy. So Superman was actually on point with that. But again, same type of thing. I feel like what Superman thinks would be like a happy ending for for other characters is a bit skewed.
Hey, Anthony, at least he didn't take him up to some mountain cabin, turn off his power source, and go, don't climb down this. I thought you were going to say the same thing. He did the same thing with Batman. Like he faked out Mysterio with false kryptonite, thinking he was dying to get him to reveal himself.
Yeah, the other thing,
and
yeah,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is very, very relevant. There were other stories that I remember being a child, and even I was like, wow, they're really pushing this. Like some robots were writing full stories for the Daily Planet. Like, I mean, there were certain stories where at the end of the story, Superman flies back in. It goes, hey, good job with that story. So these robots were so functional. They could do investigative reporting. They could type up front page stories. Perry White, the editor, was pleased. And then lo and behold, you learn the robot was filling in for all the Clark Kent scenes for the entire issue.
Yeah, I just feel like these robots, beyond pushing that suspension of disbelief to its breaking point, I just feel like it became too much of a crutch, especially when they needed to explain something away, like, oh, it was a robot. But again, it was a staple of the era. And like I said, I mean, they used them in that 90s storyline. And so it was kind of cool to see these earlier these earlier stories that utilized the robots. I just wanted to say too, and this is not specific to any one story, but we talked about the the length of some of these stories. And in my golden age reading, I mean, almost all of those stories were at most half an issue. So we were talking 12, 13 pages. And now in these Silver Age reads, there were a few that were still in that range, but we're now running into a lot more of the full issue stories where we have, a single storyline broken into 3, 8-page chapters. So that was definitely a shift that I noticed. And then this was not new. This was part of the Golden Age stories as well. But one thing that I've been struck by in reading all of these pre-crisis stories is the, I don't know what you call it necessarily, the setup page, the first page of the issue, kind of giving you a little preview of an action scene or an emotional scene to come with a little blurb about like what you're about to read.
Right. And also the first page of the issue was in some ways a replica of the cover.
Right.
So it was almost like a second cover. But yeah, that's where I came to enjoy, and you saw how DC changed, because that first page would be a preview of the story. It was better when they got more into the Marvel style, where the first page might be one single frame, but it would start the story as opposed to be separate from the story, separate from, teeing it up.
Yeah, it was just interesting. Again, just you going back to the sensibilities and the conventions of storytelling to see how that evolved.
Well, one other thing occurred to me literally this second. I wonder if they had that first page be a little bit different, because for some of these stories, even we read the 24-page, 8-page things, right? But when you had 3 separate stories in the same issue, you really didn't know what was gonna be the cover story. So maybe they did use the blurb, to tee up that individual story when there were 3 different stories.
Right. So moving along here. So we've been going for about an hour and 40 minutes, but this has been great. And we don't have a ton more stories to get through. So I think we're in good shape here. But 1960, Adventure Comics 271, How Luther Met Superboy. Again, like I said before, just this ability to go back and see the origins of the elements and the conventions that I'm so used to, but see where they started was really cool for me. And as you and I think by now listeners are well aware of my deep love for the television show Smallville. I mean, at the heart of that show was the doomed friendship between Clark and Lex, and we spent 7 years watching these two guys go from best friends to enemies, and it was for all of the show's faults. I think that was one area where they really nailed it. I think they did a great job of showing how they ended up where they did. But again, I had never read this Silver Age story where we get the backstory between Superboy and Lex, and we get to see how again they started off as friends and allies, and it took a turn. And well, I guess let me toss it to you. What were your impressions of this issue?
Uh, in a sad fashion, Anthony, I did not read that for this discussion.
Rich, it was you put it on the list.
Yeah, I know. But at one point, you had also said, "Hey, we don't have to read every single one." So I'm doing this off memory. Um, but yeah, they were friends, and then again, now I'm being in a malicious humor frame of mind. I guess Superman or Superboy should let him burn to death, right? Because he blew out. There was Luther was doing an experiment. Superboy went to protect him and save him and wanted to extinguish the fire that I guess was a chemical fire. But somehow it made Luther go bald. And that created this enmity and resentment towards Superman and fostered the hostility and the lifelong antagonism.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it's funny though because I feel like Lex just comes off. I mean, appropriately enough, I suppose, but I feel like Lex just comes off as like such a psycho in this issue from the jump because it starts off with Superboy. He's on flying on patrol and he notices Lex and he's like, oh, that must be the new boy in town. Let me go introduce myself. And he hasn't clocked the kryptonite that's lying there. And Lex does Superboy a solid and he's like driving a tractor and he pushes the kryptonite like off a cliff. And that saves Superboy. And Lex is thrilled to meet Superboy and in fact shows Superboy this like shrine to him that Lex has created. He's a fan. Like Lex is a Superboy fan, and he has I guess much in the same way as Superman will have his trophy room in the Fortress of Solitude and his character specific rooms. Lex has something similar for Superboy. And as a thank you for getting rid of the kryptonite, Superboy builds Lex this state
A
of the art
laboratory.
laboratory, right? So they really get off on a great foot. And they just want to keep this gratitude circle going. So Lex decides to come up with an antidote for kryptonite. And but as you had described, eventually he knocks over this vial and it starts a chemical fire. And Superboy happens by and he uses his super breath to try to put out the fire. But the combination of chemicals that are exposed to each other cause Lex to go bald, and Lex blames Superboy. And like you said, this sets them off on this path, and it's like I don't know, I don't know what the right response would have been. It's like from Superboy's perspective, super breath sounds like a natural response to a fire. At the same time, yeah, maybe you want to see who's inside first, if there's a way to get them out. I don't know. But then again, from Lex's point of view, it's like, yeah, what did you want Superboy to do? I don't feel like Superboy's use of super breath in that instance was so it was
Egregious.
so egregious that it's like, why would you have done that? It's like, well, it was a fire. That's the power I have for
Yeah.
fires.
Yeah. Yeah.
But and I say that Lex just comes across as such a psycho because like he blames Superboy, and Superboy, I think for the most part is like he's apologetic and he doesn't. And throughout the rest of the story, like Lex just wants to show that he is this great scientist. He's better than Superboy, and he creates like all of these inventions to help the town of Smallville, but they all backfire. And I don't have the specifics off the top of my head. But something like these fast growing trees, but then they grow too much, just stuff like that. And it's like every invention he comes up with, there's some problem with it. So it's like I don't think he's as great a scientist as he proclaims to be. And he keeps blaming Superboy, but Superboy is just like so calm and forgiving, I feel like throughout the story. But yeah, I don't know. It didn't have the depth or nuance necessarily that you might want to see in a story about how these two guys became enemies. I think, you know, when Mark Waid reintroduced this backstory in Birthright, I think he did it in a way that was a lot more effective and that did much greater service to the characters. And for anyone who hasn't read that, I encourage them to. But yeah, this was interesting. It was fun.
Yeah. No, I agree. You gave a superb perspective. Your comment about him not succeeding with some of his experiments, clearly he fixed that in some of the later story, the other Luthor stories we're going to touch on real soon.
Well, so okay,
Um,
so on that note, because that's a perfect segue. One of the stories on our list that I'm going to kind of jump over in the interest of time is the Return to Krypton, and I know you did not reread that in advance of this, correct? So I think that's fine if
Correct.
we kind of jump over that. But yeah, basically Superman goes back in time and he has this, he develops a friendship with his parents. He falls in love, and the woman he falls in love with, Lila, we'll see her referenced in subsequent stories. Like I said, in the 2000s, the super teams, the creative teams on the Superman books, would do new returns to Krypton. So it definitely, I think, was an inspiration for later stories, and again was indicative of the amount of time that Superman would would be spending on Krypton in the Silver Age. But I want to jump to Superman 149 from 1961, The Death of Superman, which, again, if you've been listening to this podcast for any period of time, you know that 1992's Death of Superman, that was my entry point. So to read this imaginary story that was not ever intended to be in continuity, but that came 3 decades before the story that got me into Superman. It was fascinating. I mean, the short version is that Lex tricks and kills Superman, and he stays dead, which was shocking to me. And I'll circle back to that. But what were your impressions of this story?
I want to let you say a few more things, Anthony, because
Okay.
no, this is something that I've got so many thoughts on this. So I don't want to step on your toes, or I've got so many thoughts on this thing.
Well, it's all right. You can go first. Do you really
Okay.
rather me to
Okay.
keep going? No, you go. Because I want to. Again, you grew up reading these stories. You've come back to them. I mean, I would love to
Okay.
hear.
Okay. This made a big impact on me when I read it as a child. And it's something that's stayed with me. And then even when I read it for this discussion, it still has a very profound, vibrant impact. I have to confess, I kind of find it gloomy and morbid and just depressing, and I feel kind of morose at the end. But to your point, some of the things that really crack me up, I'll go through it and I'll be typical Rich Roney. I'll elongate this. So the story starts out with Lex Luthor in this prison yard, right? And he notices a meteorite like over, I don't know how all the other guys walking around don't see this thing, but only Lex sees this meteorite of, I think it was element Z. And obviously, he's very confident. I'm just going to sneak. I'll punch this guard out so he makes me shovel near where the meteorite is. And I'll just pick up shards of the meteorite and go work with them in my cell. So obviously, it's not toxic or threatening. The meteorite doesn't hurt people. Kudos to him for being that brilliant. That kind of mystified me. But like you said, he uses this element Z. I think at first to cure cancer. He cures cancer, and then later on, he's released from prison because he said he turned himself around, and Superman helps him get more element Z so they can cure cancer on a worldwide level. And then he goes, "Hey, I'm going to start working on curing heart disease." But it's all a fake setup. And even the thing that cracked me up, I know you found this. Hope you made you laugh. He gives Luthor a signal watch just like Jimmy, but it's got a different frequency. And there's one scene when some other gangsters are angry at Lex for reneging on being evil. They throw a grenade at him, and he hits the watch, and like instantaneously, Superman's there.
Yeah.
That they threw that thing with such speed. It was like 6 feet away from him. All of a sudden, Superman appears and saves him from this grenade from the other gangsters. But it's all a fake. It's all a fake out. Somehow, Superman, to protect Luthor from the other gangsters, builds like a space science lab for him. And he can do his scientific experiments up there. Somehow, Luthor kidnaps the Superman family, Perry White, Lois, and Jimmy, brings them up there, and he makes them watch how he poisons Superman to death with kryptonite radiation. And even as a child, I thought that was pretty gruesome. That was pretty gruesome. Like you said, I was waiting, like, how's he going to get out of this? Maybe it's a robot that's really trapped in that slab. That, even to this day, I still feel bad when I read that. It just seemed like very, very, very gruesome the way he killed him in front of his friends when they couldn't do anything. It seemed so evil and vindictive and despicable. But then to keep going, Supergirl was the secret weapon, or the emergency weapon. Supergirl, basically, Luthor was totally ignorant of her presence, so she saves the day, right? They take Luthor down to Condor, put him on trial, right?
Which the Earthlings can watch
And
via Kandorian link up, which made me
yeah.
laugh as
Now
well.
I'm going to surprise you. There was I got two big points I want to bring up. They explicitly stated this in the story, that this was just like Adolf Eichmann, right? And at the very time Siegel was writing this, Adolf Eichmann, who was one of the architects of the Holocaust and did all the logistics to move the Jewish population to extermination places, he was on trial in Jerusalem. And Israel really, really, really communicated this to the world. So every day there were videotapes that were flown from Jerusalem back to the United States, and this was broadcast in the U.S. So this was broadcast on multiple TV stations at the very time Jerry Siegel was writing this story. And I even saw, I checked it on Wikipedia, there were certain pictures of Adolf Eichmann in trial surrounded by a bulletproof glass booth. Luthor was likewise in a bulletproof glass booth in Condor. So there were parallels. I could really see how it influenced Siegel. The last 2 points I want to make, and I'm sorry to dominate this, let me get these out and then. But the thing I found so powerful was Luthor figured he'd do the same ploy to escape punishment. Hey, I'll make Condor big. I'll let you guys get back to your normal size. I was so impressed with the honor and the principles of the Condorians, where they chose justice over self-interest. I thought that was a powerful, powerful lesson. But the other thing, and Anthony, this you stimulated this only by going back to these stories and syncing up the writers and the artists. I got to wonder, Jerry Siegel created Superman. How did he feel about writing this story where he destroys his own creation? I would that really that's a huge question mark in my mind. I mean, like, what was it? 24 years earlier, he created this character, and as you said, he was a champion of the oppressed. I really wonder what was going through Siegel's mind. Now, clearly, the trials in Jerusalem, because they explicitly state Eichmann by name, that must have had a profound effect on Siegel. But I also wonder what was going through his mind as he was killing his own creation. So, thank you for letting me rant.
No, not a rant at all. And I appreciate getting your insight. And that's a great question about Siegel. It's funny because in Paul Kupperberg's introduction to the collected edition for Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, the final pre-crisis Superman story, he talks about how, when Julius Schwartz was trying to find a writer for that two-part story, the first person he went to was Jerry Siegel. And the idea was, hey, you wrote the first Superman story. Do you want to write the last one? And Siegel was, according to the story, Siegel was keen to do it, but there were legal issues. And, we're all familiar with the legal battles that Siegel and Schuster had with DC over, ownership and compensation for the character and credit. So ultimately he wasn't able to do it, but and it's funny because I love Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. Yeah. I wonder what it would have looked like had Jerry Siegel written it. I wonder if it would have echoed this, 61 story at all. I don't know, but that's a great question. I wonder if anyone ever asked him that and if that's recorded somewhere, because it would be fascinating to know. I would echo everything you said. I think for me, the things that stood out, the Kurt Swan art in particular, and I enjoyed his art in all of these issues that he did, but that one in particular, and I read it on my iPad and it was just bright and crisp and clean. And it just, man, it held up. It was so beautiful. But beyond that, it's labeled as an imaginary story. So you figure, well, anything can happen. At the same time, and as we've been saying throughout this whole episode over the past 2 hours, it's like these were very innocent, child-friendly stories. So as I'm reading this, I was like, well, there's no way he can remain dead. Like you said, either it'll turn out to be a robot or they'll find some way to revive him, or he knew Luthor would betray him and he was only pretending to be dead. Like there has to be something. And, I remember, I'm keeping track of the pages as I'm scrolling through. And I remember thinking to myself, like, not much time left. If they're going to do this, they better do this soon.
He better get off that slab fast.
And he stays dead. And, to your point, it is a major downer. I mean, Superman doesn't go out in a blaze of glory. He gets, he's a sucker, basically. He falls for Luthor's ruse. Luthor, we have page after page of Luthor, again, curing cancer, curing these diseases, proclaiming to be on the straight and narrow, getting that signal watch, like you said. He and Superman are friends, effectively.
And Superman builds the laboratory for him to protect him, where he can really.
Yeah. He's always building a lab for Lex. It is actually a really nice, it is a kind of a nice compliment to that Superboy story we just talked about. But yeah, and then ultimately Superman just gets tricked, strapped to a table and murdered with kryptonite. And that's it. My takeaway from the story is that this was a pretty good Lex story. It was a pretty good Luthor story, not a great Superman story, and as far as endings of the character, I would not rank this one very highly. It's funny because when I had our mutual friend Mike on the show, he was on the Golden Age episode, but he was also on the previous episode. And in that, a big piece of that episode was a discussion of whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow. And I said in that episode, I was like, it's surprising, for a character who's been around for as many decades as Superman, there aren't a ton of quote unquote final Superman stories. And I said, I'm sure I'll encounter a few, I know with the imaginary stories in particular, I'll encounter a few when I do my Silver Age read in particular. And sure enough, that proved true. But yeah, I would not rank this one very highly. And even as a Luthor story, I guess I'm kind of mixed on this, because on the one hand, it's like, yeah, it feels pretty in character that he was evil all along and this was all a plot. But part of me would have loved to see the story where he actually did turn over a new leaf and actually did repair that friendship with Superman that they once had. I think that would have been really interesting, but obviously not the path they chose. But yeah, that was a standout story for sure.
Yeah, even today, I just feel very depressed at the end of it. I just feel depressed. It was morose, like you said. Superman's decency, his willingness to take the high road and try to forgive the sins of the past and become friends for the future. He was deceived and beyond that murdered. And but I also, as a child, I remember thinking how disgusting and gruesome it must have been for Perry and Lois and Jimmy to watch this. And really, Superman was just a subject in the thing. But again, what really resonated with me, even when I was a child, was the principles of the Kryptonian, the Condorian population, where they chose justice over the thing that would have given them freedom. I was just impressed with that.
It was
Um,
it was a I have to say you're right, and that was a perfectly fitting end for Luther. I think that his plan backfired, right? The ploy that got him his freedom in the first place, that enabled him to enact his ultimate revenge on Superman, ultimately backfires with the Kandorians, and he ends up in the Phantom Zone. So it was really all for nothing. And so I think as far as the end of Luther, I think it is actually a pretty fitting and very poetic end for him. So I thought that was effective. I want to jump to,
yeah.
and I know because we've been going for 2 hours now, and we can circle back to Superman Under the Red Sun if you like, but I really want to make sure we get to Superman Red and Superman Blue. And before that, the one thing that I want to say, and this really can be, and it actually will be in the future, its own episode. So I won't go crazy with this now, but I mentioned earlier about how this Silver Age reading assignment has given me a newfound appreciation for a lot of stories, modern stories that I had previously read but didn't really know, I guess, the foundation for them. And in much the same way, that we're getting a little bit of a theme that's emerging here on these episodes, in much the same way as my Golden Age reading helped me appreciate what Grant Morrison was doing with his New 52 run on Action Comics, so too has my Silver Age reading given me a whole new perspective on All Star Superman, Grant Morrison's 12 issue epic that's widely regarded as one of the best quintessential Superman stories, that of the two of us, only one of us has read, which which is shocking to me, Rich, because now having read all these Silver Age stories, and I went back, over last night and today, I didn't have a ton of time, but I fit it in. I reread All Star Superman in the context of these Silver Age stories, and it was like, oh my God, he was writing, or actually, Morrison now identifies as they, them. So they were writing Silver Age Superman. And we talk about final Superman stories. The whole premise of that is that Superman is dying from sun solar radiation poisoning, and so he's getting all of his affairs in order. And it's such a beautiful story that I appreciate in a whole new way now, because so many of the elements that we're talking about here, like the Bottle City, like the character Van Z, like the robots, the fortress with the crazy experiments and the shrines and the trophy room and the intergalactic zoo, the Bizarros and the mad scientist Lex, and the
And
Lois
even
who does
Lois getting powers.
the Lois getting powers, the Lois not knowing the secret identity, all of it is straight from the Silver Age. And man, I really came around, because it's not that I ever disliked All-Star Superman, but here's the issue that I always had with it, I guess, is that it does play into that version of the character that is more godlike and more removed from humanity. And that never really resonated with me. And when it came out, as much as the All-Star line and All-Star Superman in particular, it was billed as an alternate take on the character. And I recognize that and I appreciate that. At the same time, I was so used to the version of Superman I had been reading from the 90s into the early 2000s that when I read that All-Star Superman iteration, it was, to me, it felt so disconnected from the version of the character I knew and the dynamics I was familiar with. And as much as I could appreciate the story, and I know people loved it, it didn't really grab me the way it did a lot of other people. But I've really come around on it, and it's the sort of thing where I know you're not a fan of the artist Frank Quitely, but if you can get past that, and honestly, I love his art, and I think he does some really interesting stuff in there. I mean, even if you don't like his particular style, he tells a story really well visually. But even art aside, as someone who is a fan and has this love for Silver Age Superman, I mean, All Star is an ode to Silver Age Superman in much the same way as Morrison's New 52 run was an ode to Golden Age. So I'm just putting that out there
Interesting.
for you. And
Interesting.
if you get to it, you
Interesting.
get to it. If not, I understand. But I just want to share that my perspective on that story totally changed after reading all these Silver Age stories. Because I finally got what Morrison was doing, like the version of the character he was really playing with, they were playing with.
Interesting. Before we move to the next issue that we want to analyze, and I truly don't think we're going to get to it tonight, but I read a number of Luthor stories because I had never read them before. And aside from 149, where he is evil incarnate, later in time, other writers really took steps to show him in a different light, especially the whole thing with him being on, the duel between Superman and Luthor. They went to the planet Lexor, a red sun planet. And they cultivated this own backstory there. These people at one time were a super advanced civilization. They were dependent on machines. They forgot how to maintain the machines, and then they were like really, really desperate for help. The planet was in desperate need of water. Luthor becomes a hero on that planet. So there were a number of stories that took place where the writers evolved and really gave heroic attributes. At a certain point in time, we might want to start dissecting some of those other Silver Age Luthor stories, just to show how they kind of let the character evolve into different venues.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I definitely plan to spend more time on Lex and Lois and Jimmy in the future. They'll get spotlight episodes where we really take a look at how they changed over time. I love how I put that whole thing out there about All-Star Superman and how you should read it and how it evokes the version of the character you love. And you just said interesting, and you said something completely different. That's fine though. That's fine.
Anthony, are you surprised?
No, I'm
are
not.
you surprised?
I'm not.
I mean,
it's all right. But it just, I guess the last thing I'll say about it is, I think what's cool about it is that, again, it takes this version of the character, but it tells a story through a modern, not even so much a modern, more of a timeless, but we'll say a modern lens with modern storytelling sensibility. So, as we are looking back on these Silver Age stories, it's like, yeah, the way the stories were told was, it's a little tough to kind of, fully get engrossed in now as adults in 2021. But so to kind of take that version of the characters and tell a story with them using all of the tools at a creator's disposal in the modern era, I think made for something really interesting. But
Anthony, there's no doubt in my mind that All-Star Superman is, I think it was the editing. That's why it's such a success. It was the editing of that.
We know the assistant editor, Brandon Montclair, so I'm sure it was.
That's exactly it.
Did you watch the movie, the animated movie?
No, I didn't even know there was one. So
well, there you go. How about this? Why don't you watch the animated movie? It'll take honestly, it'll take an hour and 10 minutes of your life. You don't have to deal with the art that you don't like, and you'll get the story. So I'm just going to put that out there. But anyway,
Okay.
we'll talk more on, in the future on the show. We'll talk more about Morrison and All-Star in particular, but I really came around on that. So the last one that I really want to make sure we hit on is the 1963 story from Superman 162, The Amazing Story of Superman Red and Superman Blue, and written by Leo Dorfman. And this was another imaginary story and another quote unquote final Superman story, but with a much happier outcome. But this is this, oh my God, there's so much going on in this story. And from a psychological perspective, I don't think any of this was intentional, but it's like really fascinating. I think what it says about the character of Superman, the basic premise, it starts off with, and this going back to things that make me laugh, the Kandorians take Superman to
Oh my
task.
God.
They're like, hey,
you're a failure.
You
You're a
failed.
failure.
Like you failed.
We're going to give you 6 months.
Yeah. And
you
if
better
you don't
get your act together.
and it's like, if you don't get us out of this bottle, we're gonna send someone from the bottle to replace you. And so he conducts this experiment on himself using the rainbow of kryptonite, right, to enhance his intelligence, but it also has the unintended byproduct of splitting him into two people. And, going back to Adventures of Superman, there was that episode we talked about where Superman has to be in two places at once and he splits himself in half.
Yes.
This again, a different version of that, but interesting to see it play out again. And so, one of them is in a blue costume and one is in a red costume, hence Superman Red and Superman Blue. And they set about, basically taking care of everything. They're able to solve every problem on their to-do list. What were some of the other things that they were able to accomplish?
Well, how shall I say it? Why don't we try to do the things that they didn't accomplish? There's nothing. I mean, if I may.
Yeah.
If I may. This story floored me. Now, interesting, Anthony, I really only read it for this discussion. I remember as a child glancing through it. But again, for some of those Silver Age, they're pretty dense. You got to commit to reading these. There's so much exposition. But yeah, like really the first 2 pages, I mean, they really, really bitch him out. Like, hey, you got to come to this meeting. They get on the view screen. You have failed at everything you've done. You failed at everything. We're giving you 6 months. If you don't get your act together, we're going to replace you. So he and Supergirl, but I think his assignments, I mean, they're pretty broad. I mean, like restore Condor to its normal size, develop an antidote or a cure for kryptonite poisoning, and no pressure here, wipe out all crime and evil.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then yeah. No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you go.
So like, he goes in this, once again, the booth, like the booth with the last days of, he goes in there and he puts that goofy thing on with all the colors of kryptonite. And Supergirl kind of goes, hey, I should do it. And he goes, no, I've got to do it. They gave me the assignment. And the thing is, apparently he should increase his intellectual brain power by 100-fold, exponentially. But there's some, like you said, it's super painful. He starts screaming. The booth explodes, and he's split into the two characters. But I will tell you, even as a child, I didn't like this story. It moved too fast. It created an absolute utopia. I mean, I obviously you can my tone. I'm shouting. I mean, like he comes up with some cure for all disease. I mean, he drops a couple of drops in the Mississippi River. Next panel, the blind people are taking their glasses off. It's the blind are seeing, cripples are walking, right? That's done, right? What cracked me up reading this was the hypno satellites that they put in all around the earth that basically basically, they give Zatanna a hard time in Justice League, but it plays with everybody's brains. It wipes out crime and evil, right? It has an even far more reaching effect because apparently it can even go into the Phantom Zone and wipe out crime and evil there. So the whole thing with the anti-crime hypno rays and satellites, the an afternoon's work, they cure all disease. They restore Condor to its normal size. And then surprisingly, what I didn't get was the Condorians go, you know what? We don't want superpowers. Take us to a Red Sun universe. Now, what I don't understand is they had everything they wanted. They were on a normal planet. They were normal sized. They could rebuild their culture. They rebuilt the Jewel Mountains. And then they decide, you know what? We don't want to be superpowered. Take us to a Red Sun universe. And then even Supergirl goes, you know what? I really don't care for Earth anymore. I'm going to go live with them in that planet. And then one other thing I didn't like, and I'm sorry to dominate this. I'll turn it back over to you in a moment. What cracked me up was kind of the goofy stuff. Mixlix Pidlick comes in and he's cured. And then the other thing that kind of I thought was just too much too fast was the love. Like, they had some goofy thing where, hey, let's erect some big magnetic symbols of LL, right? And it'll determine which of us gets to go first with our true love, right? Now, very fortunately, how am I doing this right? Superman Blue loved Lana, and Superman Red loved Lois. The other thing that floored me was, hey, they're going to have a double wedding, and they go to Jimmy, be our best man, and hey, let's make it a triple wedding. Why don't you and Lucy tie the knot with us too? So they have this triple wedding. And then one of the Superman Red decides, I really don't like it here. I want to go back to Condor or go back to Krypton. So they did separate things. I thought a more modern writer could have really done something if they both loved Lois and there was rivalry or friction. Here they made it this perfect, like, well, you know what? I've always loved Lana. I've always loved Lois. No harm, no foul. I will say I thought it moved far too fast. They created an absolute utopia in 23 pages. Lucy Lane had the best line in the whole thing. Like at the very last, Jimmy says something optimistic, and Lucy's going, I wonder. So, sorry for my rant.
No, not at all. Yeah, again, I really did find this fascinating. What I was going to say before, something that that popped into my head when you were talking about the list, right? His list of things to do.
Yeah, 3.
A mutual friend of ours, Brian O'Day, who we met through our local comic shop. I think he's since abandoned this quest, but for years he had this list of comics that he wanted to own, and like classic key issues, and he had them all written out. It was a handwritten piece of paper, and it was like Amazing Fantasy 15, Amazing Spider-Man 1, Amazing Spider-Man 2, and I remember us saying to him, like, I don't know if you need to write those down. Like, you'll probably know, like, when you have Amazing Fantasy 15. And we love
or Fantastic Four 1.
Yeah, there were certain things on that list where it's like, yeah, I don't know that you need to really write that. Like, you'll know. And it's the same thing here. It's like, and again, I know it's just, a convention of the story, but it's like, do you really need to write down, wipe out crime? That's your whole thing. But so the fact that it was actually written out was very humorous to me.
I'm glad you brought that up because I do remember one of the early panels where the two Supermen like go into a room and they put it on a whiteboard, priorities, restore Condor, cure kryptonite poisoning, eradicate crime.
Yeah. And as far as aspects that could have been mined for more drama, when Electric Superman was split into red and blue in the 90s. Now, I have not gone back and reread these stories, so someone could fill me in or refresh my memory. But I think they did play with that a little bit more because at the time Lois and Clark were married, and now all of a sudden there were two. And I forget offhand exactly how they handled that. I think like both Clarks slept on the couch. It was something like that. But they did kind of explore that a little bit. The other thing where it really lost me was the Hypno anti-evil ray. Because to your point, right? You were referring to when you mentioned Zatanna, you're referring to the Identity Crisis storyline
Identity Crisis.
by Brad Meltzer, right? Where we find out that Zatanna had been and certain members of the Justice League had been mind wiping villains over the years, and it raised all these ethical questions. And that's not something that's dealt with here at all. That would have been a really interesting, debate to have within the pages of the comic. Interestingly enough, though, going back to the Supergirl TV show, a major plot line last season, was it last season or 2 seasons ago? I'm losing track at this point. But Lena Luthor, sister of Lex, she wanted to launch this basically the same type of device that would basically fix everyone, and it was called non nocere. It was like do no harm. And so the idea was that anyone affected by this like wouldn't be able to harm anyone else, would not be able to commit any evil. So that idea got a modern spin on it, and in that case they really did get into the ethical implications of it. That's not something that's explored here, and I that doesn't feel very Superman like to me, to like have this basically mind control ray that's going to eliminate crime. So that was a tough pill to swallow. But my I don't know, my biggest takeaway, and when I go back to the psychology of this, it's actually kind of heartbreaking, I think, and it actually really it did make me sad. This idea, and I don't know that this was the intention, but I read this story, and you laid it out beautifully, right? That each Superman picks a different love, right? One picks Lana, one picks Lois, one picks living powerless on New Krypton, one picks living with powers on Earth, right? And they both do seem happy enough. Now, to your point, Lucy does raise the question at the end of like, well, which one's happier? Are they both happy? Will they remain happy? And that was kind of an interesting note to end on. But I'm reading that and I thought to myself, like, what does this say about the character? Like, is he so conflicted, so torn between two women, two loves, two homes, two ways of
Two
life,
cultures.
two cultures, that the only way he can achieve happiness is literally to be split
Yeah.
in two?
Split.
And so for the character we read throughout the Silver Age who's not split in two, how tortured must this person be? It really actually kind of made me sad. And, again, going back to the versions of the character I like, I think that struggle to sort of reconcile the two disparate parts of himself, I think that's a key part of the character, but you want to see him achieve that reconciliation between human and Kryptonian. And I don't know, just reading this story, it's like, oh, like in this version, and this was my takeaway. I don't know that this was the intention. It probably wasn't, but my reading it, I was just like, man, like this is the only way. Like, how tortured must he be?
That's fascinating. And Anthony, until you posed that question, only once or twice did I ever see hints of that. And I'll make this fast. I got to remember where it was. I remember when Jack Kirby came to DC in the early 70s. In one of the Jimmy Olsen issues, he wrote, I think, a story. I think it was titled "Superman in Supertown," and it must have been New Genesis. But the story was kind of like, all of a sudden Superman goes, "Hey, you know what? I could be at home here. I'm not different. Everyone had powers, I could be part of this society." And I really resented that, because my view was the Superman I know would have always been responsible. I have an obligation to protect people the way Jonathan and Martha raised him. So I would never see him abandon his responsibilities, his self-imposed desire to protect and help. But it was a fascinating thought. Like, that was the first time. I was about 14 or 15. I thought, hey, that's pretty intriguing. Does he aspire to live with others who have superpowers and function in that way? You raise a superb question. I mean, they could have played up the conflictedness a little bit more. Like, which culture am I more comfortable in? Almost a man of two worlds sort of thing.
Yeah, again, I just feel like psychologically, there's a lot to mine there. Again, I don't think that was the mandate of this story, but it did raise the thought and the question for me. So I think that brings us to the end of our Silver Age discussion. We hit just about everything that we committed to for this list. We are doing an episode of Digging Deeper, the Patreon exclusive companion podcast to this show, where we'll be talking about Superman 156, The Last Days of Superman, an Edmund Hamilton, Kurt Swan story. So if you want to hear us talk about another Silver Age story in a little bit more depth, make sure you sign up for the Patreon and listen to the new episode of Digging Deeper, which will be out 2 days after today. Rich, you and I have been planning this for a long time. And, from my earliest planning of this podcast, I knew when we got to Silver Age, this would be your episode. Is there anything else that you want to say about Silver Age Superman as we wrap up here?
No, I thank you for the opportunity to explore this and do kind of a critical review. I said at the outset, certain parts of this diminished my fondness for the past, but boy, I still love the character. I'll always love the character for kind of the characteristics, the thoughtfulness, the love, the protection, the courage. Um, so it's got a very fond place in my heart. So I thank you for the opportunity to do this analysis and to take these things and look at them in more detail and kind of peel back the layers of the character and the stories. So thank you.
No, my pleasure. There's no one else I would have thought to have on this flight here than you, my friend. And, I guess to sort of wrap up on my end, overall, I enjoyed this experience. I know in the last episode, I mean, I was really hot on the early Golden Age Superman, and I do plan to go back and read more of those Golden Age stories down the line. I, I might do something similar with Silver Age Superman. I did find them interesting. I did find them worthwhile. It was cool to see the origins of so many aspects of the character that I know. That was really the sort of the highlight for me. But beyond that, yeah, I overall found it hard to connect with this version of Superman and this more, again, aloof, removed iteration of the character. But I appreciate what this added to the mythology and the groundwork it laid and the stories that it inspired that have meant a lot to me. So thank you for being my guide on this, Rich, and for curating this list and everything and having this conversation. And I want to thank our audience for continuing along with us. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a look at the Bronze Age Superman. So make sure you come back for that. And until then, remember, it's about what you do. It's about action. Digging for Kryptonite is a Flat Squirrel production. Art by Greg Schiegel, music by Basic Printer. Join the conversation by becoming part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network Facebook group. Follow Digging for Kryptonite on Instagram and Twitter, and visit flatsquirrelproductions.com to explore more of my film and podcast projects.